Last Sunday we heard in the gospel that a blind man called Bartimaeus, who was also a beggar, was screaming for help. And he was screaming, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And if you have good memory, you will remember that the crowd was trying to keep him quiet. But Bartimaeus kept screaming, and Jesus said, "Bring this man to me." Bartimaeus left his cloak, and through the darkness, because he was a blind man, he found his way to Jesus and recovered his sight. This present Sunday, Jesus doesn't have a dialogue with a blind man, but he has a dialogue with a scribe who doesn't come to Jesus with a petition like the blind man had. He comes to Jesus to put him to the test. So while the beggar was in need, this man thought he was entitled to put Jesus to the test. And he asked him this question: what's the greatest commandment? Not because he was looking for an answer that he needed for himself, but he wanted to prove or to put Jesus to the test to see if he knew or not. And Jesus will offer this beautiful answer: to love God above all and your neighbor as yourself. So the great theme of today's readings is love. And that's a word that appears in the first reading too. Love. But love is not only the theme of today's readings, love is the theme of all scriptures. If you think about it, the whole scriptures is one great book about love. Naturally, first about the love for God, for humanity, but also the love that God expects to receive back from humanity. But I think that also, among all the verbs that are important for a human life, no verb is as important for humans as love. We need no verb more than we need the verb love. Because nothing is as important in our life as love. To be loved and to give love. So precisely because it is such an important verb for us all, I think it is crucial for us to pay attention to today's gospel and to try to see how is it that God wants us to love. Because if love is the most important action in our lives, it is reasonable to be well informed about how we are meant to love. And only in scriptures we will find the true formula of love. So today, my intention in this homily is walk you through the teachings that Jesus wants to share with us about love. And how is it that you and me are meant to love? So Jesus says today, the first commandment is to love God. But let's see how explicit he is in formulating this commandment. He doesn't say just love God. He's very specific in the way that we're meant to love God. He says, love God with your heart, with your spirit, with your mind, with your strength. In other words, he is calling us out to love with everything that we got. He's not saying love God with 50% of who you are, with 75% of who you are. He says love God with everything. But let's look even more thoroughly to his answer. He says love with all your heart and with all your mind and all your spirit and with all your strength. So not only does he call us to love with all that we are, but he also says give 100% in everything that you are. So, I have an image that perhaps can help us understand what Jesus is calling us to do. Imagine that you have a jar full of water, and that you have a glass that has the same size as the jar. What Jesus is saying is the way that you're meant to love God and your neighbor is pouring the fullness of the jar so that everything in the jar is poured out in your glass. And you present that glass to God, holding nothing for yourself back. And I say today, how beautiful it is that we are called to love in this manner. How high is the vocation that we're called to? How great the objective. And I think this makes perfect sense. Think about what the saints said about love. St. Catherine of Siena, in her dialogues with God, she said that she heard that God told her, I made your soul for love. And St. Bernard said the measure of love is to love without measure. Let me repeat again. St. Bernard said the measure of love is to love without measure. So it makes sense that God would expect from us to pour all the water in the glass and to offer this glass to Him. But my opinion is that one thing is what God calls us to love. How does He call us to love? And something very different is how we love. And my sense is this: the language of God is the language of completeness and fullness in love. And our language of love is, what's the minimum that we can give? So let me offer you an example. God calls us to love with fullness and completeness. How many Catholics are satisfied because they go to Sunday Mass and that's it? How many Catholics are satisfied in giving the least? How many Catholics think that by doing the least necessary, they're okay? How many times our way of loving is not the way of completeness and fullness, but the way of loving of, what's the minimum that I have to give so that I'm okay? What's the minimum that I can give so I'm not committing a sin? And this mentality of the minimums is also a mentality of the apostles. Do you remember that episode when Peter comes up to Jesus and he asks the Lord, how many times do I have to forgive? Do I have to forgive up to 7 times? So basically he's asking, what's the minimum that I have to forgive? What's the minimum that I have to give so that I'm okay? And we all know the answer of the Lord. He says, you're meant to forgive 70 times 7. So while Peter is thinking, what's the least that I can give so that I'm okay? Jesus is saying, there's no measure in the way that you should love. So what's the point that I'm trying to make with you, brothers and sisters? The point that I'm trying to make is we're called to love with fullness and completeness, but our tendency is to ask ourselves, what's the least that I can give so that I'm okay? But you know what's the problem? Let's go back to the image of the water in the jar. Imagine that a person pours out water in the glass but leaves half of the water in the jar. What happens with water when you don't move the water? What happens with water when you leave the water there? So imagine that you find a glass of water that's been there for a month. Do you want to drink that water? No, it goes stagnant. The water goes stagnant. And that's exactly the same thing that happens with us when we don't pour ourselves completely in the glass. The water that we have left goes stagnant in our hearts and in our souls. And that's why every time that we fail to give ourselves entirely, we feel depressed, we feel sad, we feel guilty, because we know that we're called to be better. So, I want to finish this homily with this. I want to ask you a question. In what aspect of your life is God calling you to love with fullness, but you are bargaining with God to give the least? In what aspect of your life are you meant to give all the water of the jar into the glass, but you are reluctant to give all the water because you want to keep some water for later, failing to see that whatever water you leave for later becomes stagnant and really hurts you? So my encouragement for us is, listen to today's gospel that teaches us truly how we're meant to love. We're meant to love fully and completely to God and neighbor. We're meant fully to pour out all the water into the glass so that no water remains stagnant. So the big question for you today is, where are you saving some water for later? Where are you bargaining with God so that you don't give all of yourself, but you give the least possible so you don't feel bad with yourself? Brothers, let's be reminded today that only when we love without measure, we can truly experience the fullness and the joy that comes from loving in these terms. But because we know that it is so difficult to love in these terms, that's why we come to Sunday Mass. And that's why we come to receive the Eucharist. Because we know that our strengths are not enough. So we come to receive communion, and today when you come to receive communion, you can tell the Lord, Lord, this week, at least this week, help me to pour out all the jar in the cup. Let me save nothing for later. Let me be able to love with the fullness and completeness that the gospel today encourages